Today is November 13th, 1974, and I'm interviewing Rabbi Max Wall in Burlington, Vermont. I'd like to begin today by asking you first, when did you first encounter Jewish DPs, and what were your experiences with them?
By DPs, you mean specifically the title applied to people after the war was over, or Jews who had managed to escape from Hitler?
Well,
because I encountered a handful of individual Jews in Belgium.
Well, let's talk about the first time you met Jews who had survived the Holocaust.
It must have been about, well, the first time I met Jews who survived the Holocaust was Hanukkah time in 1944 in Belgium. Mm-hmm. I met two women and their, don't recall now, 3 or 4 children. I had just been assigned to the 9th Division, and a dentist had already met this family. They were living with some Belgian Jews, and he asked me if I had a Hanukkah menorah, so I brought the menorah along, some candles, and I benchlicht. And then the mothers asked me if I would tell the story of Hanukkah to their daughters, who had been brought up for about 4 years in a convent. And it was amazing to me to hear the Christological interpretations of all of this experience from the children. And then I told them the story of Hanukkah. That was the first meeting I had.
How did that happen? If you be more specific.
What do you mean how it happened?
Well, where were you? How did they meet you, etc.?
Well, I had just joined the 9th Infantry Division in a place called Stolberg, near the Aachen-Düren border of Stolberg was also in Germany, near the Belgian-German border. And no, this was before that. This was at First Army Headquarters. Yeah, First Army Headquarters, because in the town where there were a lot of troops being assigned to various units, it was called Verviers, V-E-R-V-I-E-R-S. It was an Air Force tactical center at the time, and it was also headquarters for parts of First Army. And I had just been assigned from the Repel Depot, from the replacement depot, to First Army. And Chaplain Gunther Plaut, who is now in Toronto, and I were assigned to First Army, and we were interviewed by the chaplain of First Army. And apparently he knew a lot about Jews and about Yiddish language and so on. And he says to me, from the looks of things, he says, Max Wall would feel more comfortable in the 9th Infantry Division because there are a lot of Jews there. And Plaut, he says, you sound like a German, and Gunther had come from Germany. He says, I'm going to put you with 101st, 103rd. And so it was, because 9th has a lot of Jews on the east side, he says. And they know Yiddish, and they know lox and bagel, and some of them went to yeshiva, and he threw around terms like that. And while we were waiting to be assigned to our particular divisions, I ran into this particular dentist, and he took me to this Belgian house, apparently where there are a couple of Belgian families who had managed to survive, Jewish families, and this is where the experience took place. They had escaped, through some underground fashion. Their husbands and the rest of their families were naturally all dead, and they had just been reunited about maybe 3 or 4 weeks before I met them, with their children, because the children had never been under the Germans directly. They were hidden by some nuns. So that was the first. The next opportunity I had to meet people who were still alive in spite of Hitler was not too far from a place called Nordhausen. I don't know if you heard of it. Nordhausen, as I understand it, was used as a starvation experimental camp, scientifically studying the effects of starvation on human beings. And apparently one of the inmates had managed to escape, and some of our reconnaissance troops found him, and they brought him into the battalion medical station, and I met him, and he started to tell me about some of his experiences. And then we had to move on, and so he was sent back to a larger hospital for treatment. This is the rare of us, still alive. And then we came into Nordhausen, and we saw Nordhausen. We passed through on our way.
Were you the first group to get into Nordhausen?
I don't know. Lawton Collins, who was the chief of staff, later was chief of staff, U.S. Army. At that time, he was commander of the 7th Corps, to which I think we were attached as part of the 1st Army. We were mostly with 1st Army, General Hodges, I think. And I remember his being told by my division chaplain that he had issued orders when he saw the warehouses still stacked with the remains, which they couldn't get rid of fast enough, that all able-bodied and semi-able-bodied German civilians living in the town were to be put on a burial detail. And he gave what purported to be orders to shoot anybody who stopped working to his soldiers. Now, these were people who had gone fighting the Jerry's, from North Africa. They weren't the replacements who came over to occupy, who loved the clean toilet and the beautiful Fraulein much more than the filth of the DP camps. And he was filled with righteous indignation at what he saw there. So there I saw no living. When I came, the living had already been transported away, and the army was still behaving in a human fashion, before routine set in. The next time, I was in a little town right outside of Dessau, when looking for Moses Mendelssohn's grave. Didn't have any idea where, and the Germans weren't very cooperative at the time. And Bitterfeld, B-I-T-T-E-R-F-E-L-D or F-I-E-L-D. Sitting in my office one day, and a bunch of teenagers appear in the doorway. Herr Rabbiner? Ja. Wir sind Juden. So,
Remember exactly when this was?
It must have been about 2-3 weeks before the war ended.
Before the war ended.
There was still.
So we're talking about April 45?
We're talking about April 45.
Okay.
Yes. That's right, because, yes, absolutely, because I can tell you exactly, Pesach of 45, we were still at the Rhine. My division was the 1st Infantry Division that was called across when they took the bridge at Remagen, when the 9th Armored Division took the bridge and crossed over. Our infantry division was the closest, so they were sent across. And we occupied both sides of that, the bridgehead on the other side, on the eastern side of the Rhine, as well as the town, Remagen itself. As I remember, my assistant, Maury Olander from Amsterdam, New York.
Oh, it might be very interesting to...
Maury Olander was the assistant to Rabbi Tepper, who was killed in France in the summer of 44.
O-L-L-E-N-D-E-R?
O-L-E-N-D-E-R. I think I may have his telephone number here because somebody just told me yesterday that his wife died. Would you make a note and I'll give it to you?
Yeah.
When I came to the division, naturally, he was an old, experienced chaplain's assistant because he had landed in North Africa in November of 42 with the 9th Infantry with Chaplain Tepper. In those days, the Jewish chaplain in the 9th Division was assigned to a regiment like all other chaplains were. And so he was assigned to one of the regiments in the 60th Infantry Battalion, the regiment. He was in, I think, one of the battalions of the 60th Infantry, which incidentally was the regiment that was later taken over by Colonel Westmoreland, who subsequently was Nam fame. Who, by the way, was a very fine person in terms of cooperating with religious services and things like that. Where was I? Can you? Pesach was near the last few days in March in 1945. We had survived, tell you exactly, Pesach in 45 ended, that's right, it ended in the first week in April. And I had gone back just about a couple of days before Pesach, which would make it sometimes in the last week in March, to one of the Belgian cities, Namur, to get matzahs and wine and to meet with all the other Jewish chaplains in Europe for whatever it was. And we were coming back, and by the time we got, and we had planned for a Seder for about 1,000 fellas. We found all kinds of crystalware and all the usual junk. This was a resort town, Remagen, on the Rhine. And still lots of unbroken bottles of good Rhenish wine, you know. And we prepared for about 1,000 men. By the time we got back, we had already heard that there'd been a breakthrough, and our troops were racing towards what would be shortly the end of the war. So infantry was traveling 40, 50, 60 miles a day. And I was chasing my troops with matzahs, especially one fellow who later I discovered came from Burlington, Vermont, a young doctor who had made me promise that no matter where I'd be, I'd make sure to get him some matzahs and kosher wine, because he used to come to every single service. And I got to his outfit. And the day I got to his outfit, they showed me the A&D sheet that he had been killed the day before. So I had the good pleasure of talking to his parents when I came here. So it was maybe near the end of April that we were in Bitterfeld. And this was a town, you know, where there had been hardly touched by the war. And I was sitting in my office. Now, I don't know what do you want only things to do with DPs or things that have to do with Jewish?
With anything to do with Jewish.
Okay, here's a good example. Little bits of Nikoma, if you will. En passant, on the way to telling you about the Bitterfeld. We were coming back from the front where I'd had some frontline services, and I bumped into the officer who was supposed to billet the division whenever it moved. And we were still separated, division rear and division forward. Do I have to explain these?
Yeah.
All right.
Because,
Well, division forward is where the general and the immediate tactical staff, because they didn't keep them together. Whereas division rear was that part of headquarters which did the bookkeeping and the records and the maintenance and all the other things. And they usually kept them 20, 30 miles apart, because you can get another general, but you lose all the records and your supply depot gets hit, you're in real trouble. But this was near the end of the war, and things were just a matter of days. And so I bump into this fellow from Wisconsin, who was the billeting officer, and he says to me, am I glad to see you? He says, what's the matter? He says, I need an interpreter. This fellow comes from Wisconsin, German parenthood, and the only word he knew was Rausmitten. And he didn't even know there was a contraction of Herausmittinen, you see. Rausmitten. And this was still in the days, no fraternizing. He says, we're joining up. Division rear and forward are joining up, so we're going to have one division headquarters. And this looks like a nice town. So we drove around town. Nice way to get housing, by the way. And we found a beautiful street with a tremendous school building. He says, that's ideal for division headquarters. And then looking for some individual housing for the officers. And there's a beautiful row of houses, as nice as you can find anywhere in Burlington today. And we knock on the door of the first house, and a rather attractive German woman answers the door, and she says, "Bitte." And in my tremendous German, I said, "Wir wollten herein." "Wir wollten herein." She understood me. Yiddish came in very handy. And she took us into the living room. There, would you believe it? There are some people sitting there having brandy in the afternoon. She said, "Would you like me?" And he reached for his 45. And we walked from room to room. We tested all the equipment, the beds, the showers, the utilities. And she kept asking questions. She said, and we finished. Get to the door. He takes out a piece of chalk and puts a mug and David on the door. This isn't a Jewish boy. And the same thing to the next 3 houses and 2 apartment buildings with 3 apartments in each of the 2 buildings. And then we go down to the center of town where there was a military detachment in charge of civilian activities. And he walks in, he meets a friend of his from the same town, Madison.
So he went to school.
"Ernie," he says, "what are you doing here?" He says, "I'm the building officer for the 9th Division." He says, "We're going to be settling here." He says, he takes out the map, says, "Where do you want to settle?" He said, "We found it already." We found it already, so he says, "Well, let me give you a policeman to clear out the..." He says, so we get a policeman with a armband, Zivilpolizei, on it. Turns out this fellow was a Dutchman, and he asks us in broken English, "How much time do you want to give them?" And Ernie starts figuring, it's 2:30 in the afternoon now, the division won't start moving until 8:30 tomorrow morning. You can give them until 12, 1 o'clock. So he says, "No, 1 hour." So we look at him. He says, "That's all the time they gave me when they took me into slave work for my home some 3 years ago." So we was going to argue. That's kind of the comment I couldn't resist. So we get there, and he calls all the people from these 5 buildings together, and he says, "I want the keys to every single door in your house, and I want you to come out here within 55 minutes with your bare essentials." And he spoke in clear German. And they did. They took all the keys. I was the ranking officer, I was a captain. They gave me the keys. So we got 5 houses, 5 buildings. What are we going to do? We got, it'll be looted in 2 seconds if there's nobody there. So I had my assistant and a driver. So I had, there were 3 of us. And Ernie and his driver was 5. So each of us occupied 1 building. In the course of it, I discovered, looking through the closets and the various things, the most magnificent garments from all the great cities of Europe. Civilian clothes. What was I going to do with them? I left them there. 2 days later, after the division moved in, I'm sitting in an office which we had established, and a bunch of kids come in, teenagers. Rabbiner, wir sind Juden. So herumgehabt, tears and cries. It must have been about maybe 8 or 9 or 12, I can't recall. Where are you from? From a local slave labor camp, Zwangsarbeitlager, which, where they had not been known as Jews, but as Hungarians, and were working, in their typical clothes. What can I do for you? Anything. So I went to my division chamber quartermaster, and I said to him, we need this, that, and the other thing. He says, military regulations, you're not allowed to give anything to civilians. He says, but if you're going to the warehouse, would you do me a favor? I want to get a message to Captain Levy, I think his name was, from Houston, Texas. And he gave me some message, which meant, as far as I was concerned, he says, look, don't ask me. Do what you want, and I'm sure Levy will facilitate it. Which is what happened. We went down with a 6x6 truck, those, big army trucks. And we loaded anything we could. And then we went over to a newly taken German military Navy storehouse. And from there we found beautiful Navy hospital blankets, And I remember this name especially because I've always loved sardines. Portuguese and Norwegian skinless and boneless sardines, finest of canned foods. This is probably for an officer's warehouse. And we took from there with the great largest have to have houses. So I've learned already. We drove through a nice part of town and saw some houses. I took along with me a member of the signal detachment, people who knew about wiring and stuff like that. And they examined everything, you know, whether the stoves were working, whether the gas lines were connected, you know, whether the showers were working. And took 3 houses and told the German people to get out, and put the kids into those 3 houses. And then I sent a soldier down to the Central Civil Affairs Office, tell them that their 3 German families would have to be placed with others. Fine, because these were old-time, hard-bitten opponents of the Jerrys. They had fought them from North Africa, and they had seen. They had gone through Nordhausen, they had seen other places. So they, you know, it was a great deal of Achdut there, Jew or non-Jew. That was about Tuesday. About Thursday, one of the boys and girls comes over and says, Rabina, kommen zu uns for Shabbos. So I collected whatever Jewish kids were in the area, and I drove over and I told them we'll have about 15 people. And we brought some more stuff along in case they weren't sure. They had enough stuff for 400 people, I think. And it was a Shabbos that I'll never forget. We cried and we ate and we danced and we talked. You know, it's even difficult to talk about it now. This was left as far as I was concerned. I hadn't seen anybody else. You know, what I realized suddenly, this is the first time, you know, I hadn't been reading the New York Times and all this kind of business.
This was the first time that I actually realized that this is the situation.
The first time I met a thriving young person, you know. And a few days later, they came to me to say goodbye. They were going back to Hungary to look for their families. And when I met, I think one of them in Munich months afterwards, he told me the story. Several of them had been killed on the road. A couple of them were beaten to death when they got to the Hungarian town where they used to live. And 1 or 2 had simply disappeared and drifted away, and a couple were now going officially through the underground on their way to Palestine at that time. So this was the first, you know, experience. The first time I personally saw a concentration camp, you know, one of the infamous ones, was at Dachau. That was after it had already been cleaned out, because we weren't transferred down until after the war was over, until peace was declared. And then we were moved down to be one of the 2 divisions of the United States Army that were in occupation of the American zone.
Which was that?
The 9th Infantry Division and the 1st, the big red one, the 1st Infantry Division.
And you were part of?
I was the chaplain of the 9th Infantry Division. At this point, you get into I get into some interesting problems. I can't recall dates, but the war ends.
That was in May of 45.
Yeah, May 9th, I think. And the lights go on. And as the lights went on, we began to see suddenly with eyes that had more time to look, because until then, we were still in combat in one sense or another. And we began to discover what had really happened. So the first thing that was concerned was everybody, you know, how soon can I be going home, military? And I discovered that I didn't have to worry about that, because I didn't have very many points. I had just come in the previous November. So, you know, I didn't even have to worry about worrying, because I knew I wasn't going. My assistant, Murray, piled up enough points to take me and him and his cousin home. You know, he'd been overseas since November of 1942. He had every battle star that the division ever participated in. So he left.
When did he leave? He left in...
Maybe 10 days to 2 weeks after the war was over, they were shipped home. Of course, many of them were being shipped to the States. So the war in Japan was still going on, so we didn't know. But They weren't concerned. They just wanted to get home. 3 years is a long time, 2.5 years even, especially if you don't know when it's going to end. And we began to get a hodgepodge of all kinds of people being shifted around to, you know, as divisions were going to pieces and being deactivated. We'd get people from the 45th Division, from the many other divisions in the area. And as soon as the war ended, Jewish DPs began to appear wherever there were army troops looking for, you Jewish? You know, I got a brother in Brooklyn. Could you send him this letter? And the GIs were remarkable. They did whatever they could, you know. They took letters, they took names, and then when they came back, they wrote to newspapers, they spoke to their synagogue groups, to other organizations. I think it was just about that time that we moved down into the Munich area that I met Abe Klausner, who, in my heart, you know, if he should live to be 150, and if in that time he manages to kill off 150 people, he would still be worthy of Gan Eden. I don't know what you've heard about him or...
Only the best.
It's unbelievable. You know, I never liked him personally because we grew up in Denver together, and he was always a rather arrogant guy, you know, very abrupt, and but I loved him. You know, what else could you do for a guy who risks his own neck? It goes AWOL. It just goes AWOL. His outfit's somewhere in France, and he's around here. And one minute they'll call me up and they'll say, tell that guy Klausner if he doesn't report back to his outfit, we'll put him up against the wall and shoot him down. 2 days later, the same guy will call me up and says, you know what that guy Klausner is? We just got 50 Jews across the border from Austria into the American zone of occupation near Linz. What are we going to do with them? You know, so it was, he once told the fellow who was made the civil affairs officer for all of Bavaria, a one-star general who had been a New York City Bronx politician. I can't remember his name. He wanted him to sign a document which would be an authorization for mayors in small towns around Munich to be ordered to undertake partial expense of the partial printing of the list of survivors, which he and the small committee finally succeeded in producing. And, you know, when he walked in, they wouldn't listen to him. And so the general says to him, you're kidding. And so he says to the general, as he told me afterwards, and I have no reason to doubt him, because knowing Abe, that's just the way he talks. Can I talk to you off the record for a minute? He says, sure, Chaplain. He says, you know, you're from New York City and you're in the reserve, and you don't plan to stay in the Army. How would it look if it got around in the New York papers that you had refused a rabbi the help that would make it possible for him to bring back the scattered remnants of what once was a proud and cultured and beautiful people? Even if it weren't true, what would it look like? So he used an expletive, described his mother's father, relationship to his father, and then he signed the document. This is the way Abe worked. He stole for them, he robbed for them, he threatened for them, but he did. He kept them alive because, you know, at this point. So we decided, in our immediate area, I was the only official Jewish chaplain. There was no Jewish chaplain with the First Infantry Division.
Oh, you're talking about Bavaria now?
Yeah. I was the first. I was the only Jewish chaplain.
So it was you and Klausner?
No, me.
Yeah, but
Klausner was sub rosa.
Yeah, right. But you were the two chaplains in the area. You were the only official chaplain.
Yes, and I'm making this point not for any bragging, but to make the point that it will come along later. Namely, as GIs came home, they began to say, you know, well, how do we help? Well, the only way to help that we know is write to Chaplain Max B. Wall, AP09, or write to the Jewish chaplain, AP09.
Mm-hmm. Now, the way Rabbi Klausner tells it is that he once substituted for a High Holy Day service for you during that period of time, and he told them to send packages to you.
No, it was the other way around. I substituted for him on the first night of Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
I had gone to the fellow in charge of all public buildings in Munich, and if I can only remember his name, Hendrik van Loon's son. Remember the fellow who wrote The Story of Mankind? His son was a captain or somebody in the occupation forces. And I came to him and I said, we've got lots of Jewish personnel, military and civilian. The first time in years where we've had an opportunity to have Jewish services here. What do we do? He says, we got to find a place that'll be symbolic as well as spacious. He says, looks around on the map and sees which buildings are still pretty good condition. He says, I got it. We're in a better place, and these are the words he used. Where could we find a better place to blow the shofar than in the place where Hitler used to sit and listen to his Wagnerian operas? And so he gave us the Munich Opera House for Rosh Hashanah services. And that night, those services were being broadcast to the United States, except a storm came up and they never quite made it. And I got up, and I looked out. There must have, I don't remember what the capacity of the place was, but there wasn't a single empty seat. There were lots of standing people, both military and civilians. You know how the DPs were supposed to be in one place, suddenly were in 18 other places, and there they were. Because instinctively, after all, it was Rosh Hashanah, the first free Rosh Hashanah they've had. And I'll tell you about the dickering in Kampfelderfing about Rosh Hashanah services. And I think you know me already a bit. Ich wein sehr grün. And I got up, I couldn't talk, so finally I said, Shechian. And the Amen, they responded. We shook the building so I couldn't talk for the next 10 minutes, It was unbelievable. It was at that time that Abe spoke, and he said those things to the single largest audience of homegoing troops who were still in the process of going home. Yeah, he spoke to my troops too, and my troops weren't ever in such a large single place. But wherever I went, and wherever my assistant went, this was the message.
Who was your assistant this time?
I don't remember.
Okay, all right.
There was a fellow by the name of Shmuel Carper, who was a graduate of Rabbi Jacob Joseph School. I had a bunch of assistants that didn't last for more than 3-4 weeks,
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
because they were
Sorry.
constantly being transferred along.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Wherever I went, I said, we kept on saying, send help. Because what did we discover? That the army didn't really care very much. That if it hadn't been, now I may be exaggerating, but as far as I know, these are facts. If it hadn't been for Abe Klausner, who was able to find a handful of fellows in the military, I think there was a Lieutenant Smith, he must have mentioned, who was of tremendous help to him, who almost did things on their own and then presented the military with a fait accompli, like organizing Kampfelderfink. I mean, Jews were being killed after the war was over by the Mamzerim, the Poles or the Hungarians, or who were also Zwangsarbeiter in the same camps. And it was a travesty. So the only thing to do is to get them together. Get them together. And they did. I think the first large camp was Kampfelderfink, right outside of Munich. And then there were such sick people, TB people, that they finally got San Ottilien, which was a TB center, a beautiful spot in the Bavarian mountains, which he got Dr. Zalman Grimberg at the time to head it. And every time Dr. Zalman Grimberg wanted to leave to go find his family, they wouldn't let him, and they went out and finally they found his wife and they found his son and reunited him, I think.
Who's they?
When I say they, it's Abe Klausner and his minions.
Yeah.
They did. Because, he was so important to them. Now, this is not the... Dr. Zalman Greenberg finally went to Israel with his wife and his son. And I understand his son died there a couple of years later as a result of a sickness, a disease of some kind. Now, I don't know anything about the northern part, the Buchenwald and the British zone of occupation.
We're only interested in the Americans.
Right. So, and then later on they opened up another camp, Camp Buchenwald. Have you heard his name has been mentioned? Okay. And in that particular camp I had a personal experience which almost shattered me totally. I was born in a town called Macheyev in Volhynia Gubernia, not too far from Brisk, Brest-Litovsk. And I was born in Ratne, and then we fled from the Cossacks, who were also fellow Russians, and we took refuge in the town of Macheyev. In that town, my father was a Talmud Chacham, and so we were billeted with the Machevarov and his family until we found a place of our own. And so there was always a very great closeness between us. And he used to dandle me on his knee, and I would pull his beard, Later I discovered what a great Talmud Chacham this man was. He had written a brilliant commentary to laws of Shechita called Mishmeret Shalom. And I'm in Camp Buchenwald. This is in late 45 or early 46, and there's a bris going on. And so, Herr Rabbiner, and I go there, and I meet the mother, and I say, Ich komme von Polen. She says, yeah, I come from Polen. And I mention Machev, and she gives a scream, Machev? My Zedek is given the Machevarov. It was the Machevarov's granddaughter, who had survived, though her husband and 2 children were destroyed by the Nazis, and had managed to find another man whom she married, and she was now celebrating a bris in a camp. So these were the 3 major camps that I had contact with on a consistent basis, in addition to the loose Jews who were in the greater Munich area. We were all looking for a buck, the equivalent thereof, trying to make do, because nobody was showing any great concern. The American Red Cross, they weren't very concerned about Jews. The JDC wasn't being permitted in yet. There were all kinds of obstacles being put in their way. The Army doesn't like civilians in their midst very readily. So if it hadn't been for Abe Klausner and the other handful of people like him who worked in, in other areas, it could have been horrible. And, he'd go every day to the MP stations, the military police stations, and pull Jews out of the jail there, because the MPs would pull them in, and strip them of whatever they had, and threaten to beat daylights out of them if they opened their mouths. Fortunately, these Jews had outfaced Hitler. They weren't going to be afraid of some American MPs. This involved with a personal experience that I had, which involved the possibility of my going to Leavenworth, and we'll see this in a moment. So to make a tamtzit here, people began to, first of all, I began to get mail. Not I, but my office. Nobody knew Max Wall. But they knew, Jewish chaplain, APO 9, and sometimes it was just 9th Division. After the war was over, there wasn't that much secrecy involved. I started to get it to mail. Maybe starting off with 3-4 letters, tentative questions, maybe my so-and-so. I got a letter from a soldier who sent it, and he wasn't going to be there, so I can't write to him anymore, and how do I write, this kind of business. And when the soldiers came back, they really began to talk and to write to newspapers and to urge all kinds of things. And I seem to recall at one meeting where Abe had a group of DPs and some very interested military people. And one of the things we decided was, since I was going to be there for a long time, since my point values, the only fellow who had less points than I did was Abe. And he was persona non grata with the military all the time, you see. One minute they can hang him, next minute they were going to use him. So since I was going to be there...
But they knew that he existed.
Of course they knew. What were they going to do? What do you think would have happened in the United States if it got around that the U.S. Army was prosecuting a rabbi
For helping Jews.
for neglecting to report at 6 o'clock for morning drill and for helping Jews instead?
Well, he did much more than that. He just abandoned his unit.
No, he didn't abandon his unit. He loved his unit very much, and he felt that they were under good care. He just didn't feel that they were in such desperate needs of Jewish chaplains' spiritual ministrations, since, you know, the sakana wasn't that great. I think he spelled it out pretty fairly. So one of the things we decided was to write to many national organizations, you know, the Rabbinical Assembly of America, the Rabbinical Council of America, all the rabbinical and synagogal organizations, and to many civilian or secular organizations like the AFFL, CIO.
Do you remember when this meeting took place?
No.
Where it took place?
Probably in his office somewhere in the Deutsches Museum. Yeah, that's where he set up.
Is this the same meeting that you discussed the packages?
Well, we didn't discuss packages per se. We simply discussed help.
Well, because Rabbi Lipman, Eugene Lipman, told me that he remembered, although he wasn't sure exactly where, when, how, that there was a meeting sometime perhaps in November 45 in which a number of chaplains were there to discuss, there's only one meeting, and to discuss some way of helping in it.
I don't recall. It may have been at that meeting that we were trying to find ways already in which to establish a warehouse for the proper reception and distribution of the packages.
Mm-hmm. No, his recollection was a little different. But that, okay, I see that nobody really remembers what took place that time.
Not in detail, but
Okay.
from my point of view, as it impinged upon me later on, all that was important was that lots of people I never heard of and was never in my life to meet were going to be talking about people sending things to me. And I would be the receiver because I was the only Jewish chaplain. Now, in this connection, at one point, maybe around Rosh Hashanah time, it's the only time in my life I ever handled money on Rosh Hashanah, because I made an appeal among the GIs for money to help pay for the printing of the books, which Abe was the lists. I felt kind of funny about it, but felt kind of good about it too. Just as last year, people brought up money on the Friday night after Yom Kippur War, and I was happy to receive it. So here, things beginning to roll in. Letters, first letters, because making contacts. Then gradually, some of the people began to indicate a kind of a semblance of being settled. They were now willing to admit that they could be found in Camp Veldafing, even though most of the time they were out looking for business, perhaps. But they could be reached there. And we started getting tentative little feelers, 5-pound packages, legal limits. Inside, dear chaplain, or dear Rabbi Wall, if my name was mentioned, would you please, I heard from so-and-so in New Jersey that my nephew is still living. Would you please, if you can find him, give him this package and tell him that we'll send more help as soon as he lets us know where it can be reached. So those were the moments of joy.
Well, how did you reach these people? Through
Well,
the Sharika Planta, through the booklet?
By that time, no, in a more direct way. By that time I went either to the headquarters of Camp Veldafing. They had the list of every person who was supposed to be there, or to Varenwald, or to St. Ottilien. And they had the lists, and I would check off. And if there wasn't anybody by that name, there was a bulletin board. And I'd put on the bulletin board that would so-and-so please communicate with me. I have a communication from family in the United States. I wasn't going to say package because I'd have 18 Shmuel Levinsons coming. Honesty was the great quality. You've got to understand that morality, as we understand it, played no role whatsoever, because Hitler had been much more successful than we knew. These guys who survived were not always the greatest tzaddikim who survived. They survived because they were lucky, because they had the tremendous fortuitous combination of of koyach, of ingenuity, of psychic strength, to wiggle and to twist and to manage to survive. That's why I used to laugh when somebody said, if you don't behave, I'll send the MPs after you. Big deal. They had outlived the SS. They were going to be afraid of American MPs. It was a very interesting thing. And then, you know, as time went by, packages began to arrive. Maybe 10 packages a day, 15 packages a day. It was still possible, you know, for me to take care of personally, because there was very little military work that I had left to do. Whereas before the war, maybe 98% of the Jewish personnel of any outfit where I was conducting services were present at the services. After the war, the statistics practically turned the other way around. After all, I'm not in such great danger right now. Don't have to cram for my finals. So I have plenty of time. Now, the Commanding General of 9th Infantry Division, and I will find his name for you. I can't seem to recall it. I don't know why, because there were two others earlier. He was the one that was put in charge of the division after the war ended. Called me in one day, and he showed me a letter from the AFFL-CIO war chest, war emergency chest, or something like that, in which they say that we want to help the Jewish DPs in your division area. Would you recommend to us the best ways to do so? And the general says, I know nothing about this. What do you suggest? Well, I had met. He says to me, should we do it through Red Cross or should we do it through UNRWA? And about a week or two before that, I had an interesting experience. I was sitting in my office in a little town on the Danube, Ingolstadt am Donau. Beautiful little town. And knock on the door, Herr Rabbiner. There's a tall, very distinguished looking, pajama striped, Ich bin ein Jude. And there's another bunch standing outside. I slept them all in. I said, what are you fellows doing in these clothes? They distributed, you know, civilian clothes yesterday. And he said they wouldn't give it to us. I says, why not? He said, because we're Jews. So, you know, this bothered me very much. So I put on my helmet and went across the street and was across the square. There's a gal sitting chewing gum, you know, very attractive, very sexy, very blonde, very German, typing at a typewriter, the way I play piano. I said, I'd like to see Mr. I don't know, whatever his name was. Every time, it was such a traumatic experience for me. There are times when I can't remember his name, and time when it comes, I think Mr. Watson, but I'm not sure. She says, Colonel Watson. Now, I thought that, you know, UNRWA was a civilian organization. So I said, Colonel Watson. He's busy. I look in the other room, there's a guy sitting at his table with his feet on a desk reading the Stars and Stripes. So I say, Bud. So I swing like the old-fashioned Western sheriff's office, you know, swing the gate to walk in, and she starts getting upset. I says, Fräulein, platzen Sie. I don't think it's the correct way to say, please be seated, but she understood. After all, I had a captain's bars on. And I go to the door and knock on the door, Mr. Watson. Without picking up his eyes, he says, Colonel Watson, sir. I said, oh, sorry, Colonel Watson? Chaplain Wall here. Down came the feet, you know, up came the head. Ah, sir, come in. I said, Colonel? Oh, he says, it's an old army title. I was with the British colonial officers in Palestine. So I tell him I've got a group of DPs who apparently were overlooked in the distribution of supplies and rations and so on. He says, gee, I can't understand that. We gave every DP who came to us. I said, well, they're standing out there right outside the front door. Oh, he says, those Zionist bastards. So I pulled down my zipper. You know, on one side the chaplain has the Magen David and the Ten Commandments. I said, you know, Colonel, I'm one of those Zionist bastards too. This isn't the end of the story. And I'm beginning to tremble. I can't even, and I walk across that square, and I get inside, and I'm practically heading for the general's office directly, and Captain Ernie Chambers says to me, where are you going? I said, I got to see a general. I got to see him right now. And he says, what happened? I said, I got to see a general. So to make a long story short, I got in to see the general. General took a well look at me and says, what happened? And I explained to him. And as I was calming down, he began to get hot. And he calls Paris. And apparently he talked to somebody there. Maybe it was to Eisenhower's assistant, with whom he was a fellow classmate. Smith, I forget his first name, but Beetle Smith. And he kept pounding the table. He says, I want that so-and-so out of there. And sure enough, he calls me back and he says, I want you to deliver this message. And he gives me a telegram. He said, I don't usually make chaplains as delivery boys, but I think you won't mind. And in effect it said, you're relieved and you will report back to Paris. Later on he told me that he had been relieved of all association with UNRWA because of. So I said to him when he asks me, should we give it to UNRWA, have him send this help to UNRWA? I said, sir, you know what kind of people might end up by administering this help. We had that one experience. Yeah, I said, as far as Red Cross is concerned, they're really basically a donut and coffee organization who can bring telegrams of great pain to people at home. But since by your command, since you're responsible for all people in your occupation area, since I must also be concerned about the spiritual welfare of civilians, and since I do meet them for spiritual purposes, which purposes they do, I would probably be in a better position to know where whatever help this committee wants to send should go. And he thought about it and he says, well, let me think about it. Apparently, he never got back to me again, but subsequent, this was a very fortuitous meeting. So here you have the following. People from all over America and the British zones of, the British Isles, Canada, and later on even South America, because there were relatives in America who knew relatives in South America who were commonly concerned about people in Europe, now knew that there was a focal point. And I'm sure there must have been a number of them because there were other chaplains, but I was so involved in my own that I wasn't aware of any. None in my immediate area.
Well, you're the one that stands out the most because of the number of packages that were sent to you and the difficulty you later became involved in.
That's right. So you have this, and then you have this incident in which the general calls me in specifically to ask me about how to respond to this offer of help from the AFL-CIO, concerning which I didn't know what final disposition he made. But all I know is that he called me in and we had talked about it, and I suggested that perhaps he used me as the funnel, since I was, of necessity, meeting these people for spiritual purposes. And as the months went by, the packages began to increase, and finally, I don't recall who the first JDC man was there. It may have been Levi Becker, if I'm not mistaken. You know, Levi Becker lives in Montreal.
Sure, I know.
Great guy. Just a great human being. In fact, the people whom we first sent over, the civilian workers were, I'm kind of proud of all those people. They did yeoman work.
Who, JDC workers?
Yes, the people I met. Lady Becker, there was a gal, I don't remember her name, I'm sorry.
Newlander?
Pardon?
Sylvia Newlander?
Yeah. I don't recall. I think she was Rabbi Newlander's sister.
Right.
And he used to be in Far Rockaway, wasn't he?
I think he was in New Jersey.
Wrong, I'm not sure. However, I couldn't handle, I didn't even have time, literally, to open up 100 packages each day, and to find the people. How am I going to do it? I didn't have the kind of staff and material, and the JDC was already, I think, in Munich. So.
Now, what year are we talking about? The JDC came in 46, right?
I think they must have come a little bit earlier.
Oh,
They came in late, maybe right after the holidays in 45.
Oh, that early? Okay.
Or I may have, I'm going to be looking through, and then I'll send you any specific factual date, name, and so on information, trusting that you will sometime send it back to me.
Yeah.
I think you.
Xerox it also.
Pardon? Oh yeah, I can Xerox. That which I can Xerox, I'll Xerox and send you directly. I'm pretty sure it was in 45, because they couldn't have possibly been ready to receive the large masses of material.
Well, generally, they came. Various groups came during different times, so it's. But they didn't really start working until 1946. I mean, in
Possibly.
a massive way.
Yeah, maybe with their large staffs and so on.
Right.
But I'm almost positive Lady Becker was there shortly after the holidays.
Mm-hmm.
And Abe suggested that the only sensible thing would be, under the aegis of JDC, which was already had managed to pull enough wires to get official recognition, establish some kind of a large-spaced headquarters where they could receive this mail and handle it from an administrative point of view. So they hired DPs, and as the packages came, there were two kinds of packages. There were those that came with, "Dear Chaplain, we heard from Private so-and-so or from Major so-and-so that there's help needed." So on the top of the package is a big stamp, religious material. And out of one broken corner they would be pouring forth maybe rice or flour, this kind of business. And they were coming from 5 pounds up to 70 pounds. Please use this any way you can to help our brothers. So these packages we simply took apart and put them on the shelves. Shelf for rice, shelf for sugar, shelf for this. Cigarettes were another problem, because cigarettes were more valuable than gold. And we didn't get many cigarettes, really, because people understood this. Those that were specifically directed to an individual, please, if you could possibly can, give this to my nephew, Ken Fogelbaugh. The committee, as I can recall, and I went to the post office and I authorized JDC to pick up my mail. So I'd have to go to the JDC to get my letters from my wife, because they couldn't distinguish, you see. And everything that came eventually stopped coming directly to me and then was transshipped back to JDC. They got it directly for the warehouses.
Mm-hmm.
And in these warehouses, they set up a group. They opened each package, and the package that was addressed to a particular individual, if they knew where he was, they would write a postcard to Chaim Greenberg, Camp Veldafing. There is mail and communication for you. There's a paquette from relatives in the United States or Canada. You have 3 weeks in which to claim this packet, bring this postcard with you, and any identification you've got. So I used to drive up to the warehouse and see long lines of people waiting endlessly. Of course, there was a lot of neighbor there too, because the workers themselves, oftentimes, if they saw something that they really wanted to use, it wasn't so terrible, they took it. In the meantime, there was this particular problem, you see. If you send me a package, you assume, that I'm the boss. And therefore, if the package doesn't get to the fellow you're asking me to give it to, you can blame me for it. That's number one. Number two, You may have sent me the package in the meantime. You've heard directly from some other source from your nephew whom you're sending it to. So you write him a letter saying, I sent you a paquet through Rabbi Wall. So I'm here, you're over there, and the recipient or the fellow waiting for it is over here. And he's got a letter saying that I have a package for him. And you know something? He didn't understand that I didn't have a package for him, that he'd have to go to the Deutsches Museum or wherever it was that they had set up the administrative center where you claimed your packages. He says, you got my packet? And he got all kinds